Good morning. Thank you again for coming. We had a very good and productive day yesterday with the first day. I was actually very pleased by the feedback I received, and I was actually worried at the end. It was a very long day, but even until the end, the people were still active and contributing to the breakout session. We really started the day with a very good introduction by framing the workshop with Victoria, kind of unpacking the whole concept of reproducibility and going through the different type of reproducibility from empirical, statistical, computational, and showing a little bit actually one of the just an example of what good data management can do. And of course, she also ended with some very good principles that a good computational infrastructure could do to lead towards reproducibility. And then as we framed the workshop, we had 3 good panels that were all lively. I wish we had more time for questions. I think that was one of the notes, but I encourage all of you, if they said there was a question that you intended to ask and did not ask, it would be good to send to us, and I'm sure we can always at least include in our report and then make sure that all that input is part of what we are trying to gather as feedback. I hope it's not just because we have a day and a half that this question, this conversation, an idea that comes up, that you should continue to sending to us, and we hope even when we have the first draft of the report to actually even show to the participant for continued feedback. The whole intent is, as a community, is really to collect as much feedback and ideas so that we can move these questions and all these challenges that we are discussing forward, and then hopefully we can achieve our goal. And the second day, actually, the first day we kind of touched on what we framed it was happening on our campuses, getting those perspectives. We had a panel also that gave us a little bit of an idea, some of the RDMI initiatives, as well as what is really happening, what we'll call industry. And then we recognize that these are just representative, and I'm sure there's so many of them that are out there. As a matter of fact, as I was talking this morning, I was talking to one of our colleagues who actually said, wouldn't it be nice if we had a BAF or better or further where we really bring more of those people, continue these discussions, and really to engage them to see this is just we are just touching the surface. And I thought I totally agree with you. It's just a matter of time and then organizing this. So when we think of today, we're gonna continue the same format. So we had so many actually challenges, and I was actually reading the notes last night when I got to my room, and I was very surprised by the list of challenges that was really came out from the breakout session, because we have a Google Doc where the number is there. And it goes always for lack of funding, data formats, and lack of knowledge, and informing our senior administrator, and ever-changing standard, incentivizing researchers, too many IT departments to deal with, hard to explain, need for standardized metadata, data curation, and etc. I mean, this is just a really list, a really very comprehensive list. And what we're going to switch now the conversation today is we're going to start with the first panel to kind of hear a little bit from the funding agency's perspective, because many of our researchers go to seek for these solicitations and get funded and projects, and getting that perspective would be the first part. That will be moderated by Jim from the University of Minnesota. And then we're going to have a breakout session, a break, and then have our last breakout session. So the breakout session, you're going to see the questions were slightly modified yesterday. We really want to look at the future, what's next. How do we continue this conversation? I really want to have the different table to kind of thinking, we know where we are, we talked about what we are, we know what the challenges, we discussed them all, so what's next? Basically, that's the question. And I hope at the end, when we have that open discussion, we're even gonna allow an open mic to kind of, as a community, can we kind of agree on some of the few things, maybe one or two, three things we can do next. There's already some suggestions that came my way, but I'm hoping that we can continue this. The reason I'm saying this is, for the first time, I actually brought different communities together, because many of us, some of us, we will meet in certain organizations, and there are different organizations that meet regularly. But it's not clear that those organizations really work together. In particular, this is a question that really is at the intersection of many of them, that they could benefit from all of us really contributing to it. So my hope is during that open discussion, we can find ways that we can work and continue this conversation. And I see Wendy standing, show me that it's time. But I'm going to stop here, but I'm hoping that you will find the discussion today again enlightening like was yesterday, and that really we are looking forward to continue getting your feedback. And thank you very much again.
Good morning. I have no logistical announcements this morning, so we are going to go right into our first panel. And with that, I would like to introduce Jim Wilgenbush, the Associate Director at the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute at the University of Minnesota.
Thanks, Wendy. I think as Barali said, one of the great values of meetings like this is that we get to meet colleagues and talk about some of the challenges that we face, particularly yesterday in the area of sort of data management. If it isn't sort of informative, at least it's sort of therapeutic to know that other people sort of are in similar positions dealing with users or dealing with just challenges that are sometimes technical as well. So one of the other great things about meetings like this is sometimes we have the opportunity to hear directly from our nation's funding agencies, and that's the case this morning. So it is with sort of keeping in this tradition that I have the great pleasure of being able to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Dr. Amy Freelander, who's the Deputy Director of the National Science Foundation's Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. Second, we'll have Robert Hanisch, the Director of the Office of Data and Informatics Material Measurements Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. Following that, we'll have Dr. Jeff de la Bojadere. He is the National Oceanic, Atmospheric and Administration Data Management Architect, and he also chairs NOAA's Environmental Data Management Committee. And then finally, we have Lisa Federer, who serves as a research data informationist at the National Institutes of Health Libraries. So maybe, first of all, we can warmly welcome and thank our panelists for coming today, if we could start with that. And then I would like to invite all of you to come on up and go ahead and take a seat. The format of today's panel is going to be very similar to yesterday, except we've allotted a little bit more time. So each of the panelists will have 15 minutes to speak. We've also asked, when we met about this panel, we asked that if you can hold your questions till the end so that all of the panelists have an opportunity to share with you their strategies and perspectives. Unless, of course, there's some short point of clarification, I'd be willing to accept that. So without further ado, Amy. Slides. Good point. They're up. And I believe this works. Should we give it a try? Let's see. Yep.
God, isn't that exciting?
Perfect. That works.
Advanced cyber infrastructure.
Yes.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming today. See a lot of familiar faces in the audience, but I am delighted that I see many faces I do not recognize and many organizations that I do not recognize as usually coming to these events. So full marks to the University of Chicago for not only bringing old friends together, but introducing us to some new ones. So this is the outline. It follows the standard Who Are We? For those of you who haven't come to NSF for funding or for one of our events, what do we expect in large from a data management plan? And then what do we see looking forward? But what underlies this is the question, why does NSF do this at all? And I gather, although I'm sorry I missed it, that you heard one explanation, and an elegant explanation, from my good friend Victoria Stoughton yesterday. But NSF asked this question actually a number of years ago when it instituted its data sharing policies. And the simple answer is because they are intrinsic to the nature of science. You simply cannot do good science or good research without understanding the evidentiary base and moving forward to protect that, in part for the critical reason of reproducibility and verification, and in part because it's intrinsic to the canons, the cultures that underlie our field. And that is why NSF requires the data management plan as part of the proposal process. It is intrinsic to telling us how it is that the investigator or the team proposes to manage the data that is a core element of the work that is undertaken. So NSF, for those of you who haven't looked at our mission statement recently, is an independent federal agency that supports fundamental, and I underline the word fundamental, research and education across all fields of science and engineering. We are a basic research funding agency, and importantly, unlike my colleagues on this panel, we are an extramural funding agency. So we pride ourselves on the merit review process, which is the mechanism through which the funds are dispersed to the higher education community. These numbers are a little out of date. I think these are 20, come on now. These are 2015-16 numbers, but the ratios are correct. We get between $40,000 and $50,000 requests per year for an appropriation somewhere around $7 billion. Of that, 94% of it walks out the door. And when I'm talking to an industry group, here is where I say very firmly, looking over my reading glasses, I defy any of you in this room to run your organizations on a 6% overhead. So that's what we do. We exist to push money out the door to enable the higher education advanced research enterprise across all area topics of science and engineering, very, very broadly defined. So that translates into lots of awards, a roughly 20% funding rate, although it will vary by program. We fund many students. That's an important part of our mission. We fund them directly. And we also fund them as parts of the teams that come forward to execute the work. And we have related programs. There are the fundamental basic research programs where you ask a question and we conduct a bit of research, but we also have programs that are designed to develop the STEM workforce. So the education from cradle to grave, so to speak, is an important parallel track in the work that we do at the foundation. So I said that NSF funds research across all areas of science and engineering. Now these are data from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics biannual indicators report, and it looks at some of the major funding agencies. And you sort of see the point that I would like you to see, which is that there's the NIH all the way to the left, which has a very generous and appropriation, but not surprisingly, given the mission of the organization, it is very much focused on the life sciences. Well, of course, it's a biomedical research organization, as we will hear later. And then you see our friends at the DoD and at NIST and at DOE, and not surprisingly, they are heavily invested in the physical sciences and engineering. And then, third from the left, you will see us. And what's interesting about us, and not surprising, of course, is we have lots of colors. So that it means that our $7 billion or so are distributed, truly distributed. These are the funds that go out the door, as reported to the National Science Board, are distributed across many, many fields of science. So that means when we come to data management plans, we are driven by two inherent tensions. On the one hand, you can't manage the agency through pickup sticks. You need to have a set of principles that are coherent across the entirety of the foundation, all of those awards that you saw described in the merit review slide. On the other hand, you have to recognize the heterogeneity of science. So when you come to us and you say you look at our PA proposal and award guide and the principles seem to be very high level, well, they are necessarily high level because we're not threading one needle, we're threading 14,000 needles. So that's the coherence and heterogeneity tension, and it's a necessary tension, and it drives our approach. At the same time, we, of course, want to enhance and forward robust science, where by robust science we mean protecting the evidentiary base and the necessary communication that surrounds the conduct of science, the verification of results, within the limits of law and available resources. So as a practical matter, we need to strike a balance between what it costs us to manage the data and what it costs us to do new and innovative research. Because as the director has said publicly, if we're not about innovation, what are we about? So here's the director herself talking about public access, but I think it captures the point about the relevance not just of data, but of communication as a property of robust science. And so we do the public access policy, which is an extension of our data access, of our data management policies more generally, because communication of research results is central to the progress of science. Now, the specific memo to which we were responding talked about publications and then went on to talk about data, but from NSF's perspective, we are thinking about the full range of outputs of the research that we fund, most notably from my perspective at the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. We are very worried about the preservation, the management, not necessarily the preservation, but the management of software. So public access sits, as I said, upon an established policy of data sharing that's about, I think, 20 or 25 years old, and the initial statement covered publication, data, independent of format, which meant physical collections as well as what we would now call digital collections, software and inventions, intellectual property, and the decentralized. It is in the statement, the decentralized administration of of data sharing policies. So this embodies three principles that continue to drive our actions. One is we do not claim intellectual property in the investigator's output beyond what is provided in federal law. So when people come to us and ask us why we can't do X, Y, Z on copyright, the answer is we do not claim copyright in the output. We cannot claim copyright in the output. So that's one thing. Secondly, it clearly enables cost recovery by the awardee institution. And here, I intentionally use the word awardee. I remind you, and many of you know this, NSF's relationship is not with the principal investigator in a legal sense. We make awards to institutions who are represented by the principal investigator who is responsible for the integrity of the work. And finally, which puts the principle of heterogeneity of science at the center of our policies. So our policies on data, there was the initial statement on data sharing, there was the data management plan requirement, which came into effect in 2011. In 2013, for those of you who have filled out our paperwork, you know that we asked for 5 research products that are reflective of the solicitation, the proposal that you're putting forward, and we said data. was equivalent, a data set is equivalent to a peer-reviewed juried publication, which from our point of view put data forward as a first-class research object equivalent to the scientific journal article. And then finally, there's the public access plan that was published in 2015 and went into effect in 2016. We did go beyond the requirement of that particular memo by covering juried conference papers as well as formal journal publications. And this came about, again, reflective of our underlying heterogeneity, because it turns out in computer science, the directorate with which I'm currently affiliated, the coin of the realm is not the scientific paper in the journal. The coin of the realm is the juried conference paper. So in order to put computer science on the same playing field, if you will, as the other disciplines, we included juried conference papers. So the data management plan, and please don't bother copying all this down. I intentionally created eye candy here with the expectation that the slides would be distributed subsequently and you can study them to your heart's content. Okay, so it's a required element of our proposals. It describes how the PI will conform to the data policy associated with the competition to which the proposal is submitted, recognizing that when you submit in education and human resources, it looks really different from when you submit to physics. It is evaluated during merit review as intellectual merit or broader impacts as appropriate, and let me underline this. It is evaluated. This is not just a two-page document that you shove in there. We really do look at these. And it may simply say no plan is needed, but this too needs a justification, and the expectation should be that the panel will evaluate that justification. But certainly there are parts of advanced mathematics, for example, where the data are the equations and is the publication. So we are alive to that sense of that distinction. So it may include different types of data, standards for the data and metadata, policies for access and sharing, provisions for reuse and redistribution as possible, and plans for archiving, again, as appropriate. All of these are governed, of course, by the norms and customs of the individual fields. So what does it look like from the proposer's point of view? Well, you should look at your solicitation and see if there's something special in there. And if there's nothing special in there, well, you consult the division. Many of the divisions have put forth guidance that are specific at the division level, and you work your way up the chain. And if there's nothing, well, then you fall back on the general NSF statement. So then you look at other considerations, for example, the nature of the data. In high-energy physics, for example, the data are so voluminous that our good friends at the Department of Energy only worry about data that support publication, because it is simply not feasible to do anything else. On the other hand, if it is a small, well-managed data set, or as I gave the example in higher mathematics, it may be a data management plan may not be relevant at all. So you have to look at the nature of the research that's being proposed and the data that are being created. Jeff, you're frowning at me. Always makes me nervous in staff meetings when someone is frowning at me. It means I've just gotten something wrong. But he comes after me and can clean up. Then you look at any constraints that may be introduced by the intended repository. For example, it is not uncommon for institutional repositories at the university level to refuse to accept personally identifiable information. That makes life very difficult if you're in education or some of the social sciences. And finally, you have to look at regulatory issues. So I have 2 minutes to go, and I'm going to skip through this by reminding you that this is an element of the award. It will be addressed during site reviews, site visits, and possible A133 audits. There is more guidance available. This, again, is another eye candy slide, so you have it later to be consulted. And we also see different ways in which we are embedding public access concerns, data access concerns into individual awards. And so this is a set of awards that came out of the Division of Social and Behavioral Research last year, and they attached a series of funding elements that allowed the investigators to take a step a little further beyond what they would do otherwise in order to make the data available. So like everything at NSF, it is very bottom up. So going forward, well, I hardly think this is news to any of us. It's a complex space which represents the intersection of what NSF expects you to do, what the disciplines expect you to do, institutions and policies, norms, and codes of conduct. From my own perspective, from the world that we look at in OAC, we're increasingly aware of data, if you will, in flight. So a lot of what we've talked about has actually assumed that, that there's almost a linear life cycle. You go out, you do the work, you collect data, you manage the data, and you put it someplace at the end, and it sits there until someone else comes along. And that's really a very static view of how data works in computationally and data-intensive research at scale, which is what we do. And in fact, what we see here, and again, you can study this at your leisure if you have insomnia, we move back and forth across the layers of the stack, and data moves all the time. There's the research data. It must be a teenager. So we're almost there. And so we want to think about the management of the data not at rest, but if you will, in flight. So what are we going to do? We will continue developing data management plan guidance in collaboration with the communities. Will expand them to address other kinds of data and software, and we need to begin to understand data management in the context of the research process. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was excellent. And I just want to echo something that Amy mentioned, namely that all of the slides will be available. So those are available on our website right now, I believe. So thank you very much for providing those. Robert Hanisch of the National Institute of Standards and Technology is up next.
Well, thank you and good morning. Before I get into my main talk, I just want to clarify sort of what the role of NIST is. We are not an extramural funding agency like the NSF. We do some extramural funding, but we're primarily an in-house research organization developing, as the name suggests, standards and technologies. We are the National Metrology Institute for the United States. There's a network of a little over 100 NMIs around the world who coordinate things like fundamental methods of measurement and determination of fundamental constants, coordinated under the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris. So we are in that network of people who measure things extremely carefully. First, from a policy perspective, NIST, like other government agencies, follows the OSTP and OMB directives that came out in 2013, which require the research work done or sponsored by federal agencies to be made publicly available in most of it anyway. There are exceptions for things like classified work. We also have a data product or a line of data products called Standard Reference Data, SRD, which Congress authorized the Department of Commerce to develop at NIST back in 1968. And this is a little bit of an exception to the public data policy in that NIST is authorized to collect fees for standard reference data to offset the cost of the development, maintenance, and distribution. It's not a profit-making center. It is simply to sustain those products. And they are largely used in industry. Our largest selling database is our mass spectrometry database, which is installed in essentially every mass spec instrument by every vendor around the world. So when I first heard that NIST charged for data, I was rather aghast, coming from the astronomy community originally, where everything is free. But there is kind of a rationale in that our data products become value added for vendors who then sell their instruments at value added to consumers, and they pay taxes, and those taxes come back to the agency and so forth. So there is a rationale. We give most of it away, but we have some that we sell. So our public data access policy goals are to strengthen our commitment to public access to scientific research, I'm not going to read all of these things, but basically it's all about doing good deeds for the research and industrial community. And I should point out too that NIST is part of the Department of Commerce. It was originally the National Bureau of Standards, and it was created around 1900 because at that time things like the gallon were not standardized. And if you bought a gallon of gas or a gallon of milk, they could actually be different quantities. So the National Bureau of Standards was created to resolve that problem. We have this data pyramid, which starts at the bottom with working data, followed by derived data, publishable results, and published results. We do not require our staff to make public working data or derived data. And the reason for that is one of cost-benefit analysis. A lot of the data that is produced at NIST actually comes from instrumentation that is commercial in nature. A lot of it comes out in proprietary data formats. The conversion of those data, many of which are just, testing of instruments and testing of measurement techniques, are thought to not have lasting value in many cases. People can share if there is an incentive for doing so, but it's not a requirement. But once data becomes publishable or published, we do require that it be made public and shared. We do fund some external research. I don't know what the percentage is. Barry, do you happen to know? But it's maybe, I'm sure it's less than 10% of our overall budget, which is just shy of $1 billion. For those people that we do fund, they have to provide a data management plan if the research will produce public data. The grantees need to provide metadata about their data products to us, and we take the responsibility for advertising that metadata. We have a NIST Enterprise Data Inventory with standard metadata, and that information has to be managed by us as a way of tracking the data products of the grantees. We also ask the grantees to share that data through a public repository. We do not host it at NIST. That is the responsibility of the grantee. So our basic practice is every member of the research staff at NIST engaged in experimentation or simulation that produces data has to have a data management plan, and data products associated with that research have to be registered in our enterprise data inventory. We have a system developed at NIST called MIDAS, which is an online system that our staff use to enter their data management plans and their enterprise data inventory records. And then those EDI metadata records are copied regularly to data.gov so that all of our public-facing data resources can also be discovered through that interface. But beyond that core basic practice, we are trying to do more. We are building a new public data repository for NIST-wide data holdings and a data search portal on top of that. My group is actually building that. All of our public-facing data sets are assigned digital object identifiers. And we are also building data discovery tools which are more discipline-oriented, one for materials science research, another for metrology, since that is one of our core functions, and so-called resource registries. And we've also implemented a generic data annotation tool called the Materials Data Curation System. This is originated with the Materials Genome Initiative, but it's actually a very generic tool for doing data markup at the data set level. So the data management plans are very similar to what NSF requires. We ask people what are the data generating activities, what types of data are you producing, how are the data to be managed and preserved, how are they reviewed and made available. Oops, wrong button. There we go. And so this is basically a way to generate metadata and federate that metadata into, as I said, our data inventory and then to data.gov. This is the tool that we use called MIDAS. It both supports generating data management plans, and then when data is produced, there is the data inventory record, and it links back to the data management plan. So you can basically see the pedigree, what was the plan in the beginning and what came from it in the end. This is the Materials Resource Registry. A registry is basically collecting metadata about data collections. So think of it as a yellow pages, if you will. Those of you who have never seen a yellow pages directory, if you're younger than 40 perhaps, but it's metadata about data collections, not about individual data objects. You use this to discover information, and then the information in the registry allows you to go to the resource, drill down, and actually access data from that collection. The similar infrastructure is used for the metrology resource registry. We have built this infrastructure at NIST, but this is actually deployed at the BIPM in Paris, so they host this information for the network of metrology institutes around the world. It's really important. I mentioned yesterday in one of our breakout sessions about federation. It's not possible in this world of data growth to host all information about data in one physical location. So federation is really the key. These resource registries are federated resources where individual organizations can host metadata about their data collections, but then the registries harvest those metadata records and share them one to the other using the Open Archives Initiative